On the morning of February 18th, 1943, two German students named Hans and Sophie Scholl carried a suitcase into the University of Munich. In it were several hundred copies of a leaflet, the sixth in a series of covertly distributed pamphlets calling for an end to the war and fascist rule in Germany. For months, the Scholls and a close-knit group of friends had been circulating these leaflets across Germany, operating under the enigmatic name Die Weiße Rose, the White Rose. The Scholls' resistance was not only political, it was spiritual. They were motivated by a deep Christian faith and an equally strong belief that, by supporting this murderous regime, Germany's overwhelmingly Christian population had abandoned the very values Christ stood for. They asked, why do the German people behave so apathetically in the face of abominable crimes? Is your spirit already so crushed by abuse that you forget it is your right, or rather your moral duty, to eliminate this system? This warning would largely go unheeded. For on that February morning, when the Scholls dropped a batch of leaflets from an upper-level balcony, they were spotted by custodian and party member Jakob Schmid. Within a mere 5 days, Hans and Sophie would be charged, tried, and executed. The Scholls died doing what they believed their faith demanded of them. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus demands that whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. I argue that the Scholls did precisely that. Their story is a modern-day passion, illustrating their willingness to die and suffer for a righteous campaign. But what's so disturbing about this passion story is that in it, the persecutors, the German people, considered themselves believing Christians. In 1939, a full 6 years into the Nazis' rule, 94% of the population still identified as either Protestant or Roman Catholic. Yet these same people explicitly endorsed or at least tolerated a regime whose agenda of conquest and genocide fundamentally contradicted the Christian ideals of compassion, love, and mercy. It was their actions, or more precisely, their inactions, that led to the death of those who stood for the very values Christ espoused. Spiritually speaking, the German people had crucified their own Savior. How could this be? How did so many people fail to see the abject hypocrisy of this situation? And how, in such a climate of complacency, did two students like Hans and Sophie Scholl come to believe that they were obligated to resist? These are the questions we will grapple with in today's presentation. We will trace the Scholls' moral and spiritual trajectory from enthusiastic members of Hitler Youth to outspoken dissidents. Throughout the performance, you will hear their own words drawn from their letters and diaries set to music, as befits any passionate story. You will also hear remarks from each of our distinguished panelists who will help situate the Scholls' story within its broader historical context. Before beginning, I owe a debt of gratitude to the many people who made today possible. Rabbi Dr. Shira Lander, who helped turn this event from an idea into a reality. Doctors Victoria Harms, Anisha Chung Timberlake, and Rebecca Carter-Chand, who have graciously offered their expertise. The Peabody Launchpad Office, whose support made possible the recordings you will see today. My composition teacher, Kevin Putz, and the incredible musicians who have brought this story to life. Our first speaker is Dr. Victoria Harms, DAAD, visiting assistant professor in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. She will examine the early years of Nazi rule and how institutions reacted to the party's rise.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you, Dr. Rabbi Lander, for organizing this event. Thank you all for coming here. Now, I'm the resident historian here, but I want to start with a more personal approach. Growing up in Germany, as the youngest of three, I would listen to my older sister and my father, born in 1940, oftentimes engage in very political conversations. Actually, growing up, there were never any trivial conversations at the dinner table. Oftentimes, my father would drop the comment, "Wehret den Anfängen," which loosely translates as, "resist the beginnings." Now, at the time, I'm about 6 years old, and I do not quite understand. But soon, my oldest sister put up a poster with a quote by Martin Niemöller that said, "When they came for the socialists, I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. When they came for the trade unionists, I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak." In hindsight, of course, these random conversations at the dinner table were rooted in a certain understanding of what has happened in Germany in the 1930s. Now, today, our popular imagination is dominated by scenes that are actually lifted from Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda film, Triumph of the Will. We tend to associate fascism in Nazi Germany with frenzied crowds and not particularly attractive men yelling in German horrific words. Unfortunately, that has allowed many to compartmentalize fascism and deprives us of drawing important lessons from Nazi Germany, and especially the Holocaust and how it was possible. As Andrew already told us, when Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, 32% of Germans identified as Catholic, and 63% identified as Protestant Lutheran. Now, hypothetically, these two institutions had more members than the Nazis ever gained in votes. So, hypothetically, they could have mounted a formidable resistance to Nazi rule, but they did not. Because if we only look at the terror and the intimidation, which are characteristics of fascism, we tend to ignore the opportunism and the rewards that the Nazis offered for those who were compliant and complicit in their regime. Very quickly, upon being appointed chancellor, again in January of 1933, when Sophie Scholl is only 12 years old, Hitler exploited the existing parliamentary procedures to consolidate his rule. In the wake of the fire in the Reichstag, the parliament building in Berlin, he started to change laws that bestowed upon him ever larger powers. Those who could resist and did resist were put into concentration camps. The first concentration camp in Dachau, just north of Munich, was actually established for the Nazis' political opponents, especially the communists. So that by the time that Hitler introduced his enabling law in March 1933, 81 communist members of parliament were all incarcerated. The roughly 100 social democrats in parliament voted against the enabling law. However, the centrists, the bourgeois, the middle parties all consented and approved of the enabling law that gave Hitler all powers necessary to establish a dictatorship. The two institutions, the two religious institutions, the churches, proved complicit, oftentimes because of opportunism and anticipatory obedience. Now, the Catholic Church was a minority in a way of 32%. They had the experience of the German Empire, where the Protestant Lutheran Church was the dominant Christian denomination. And Catholics were actually persecuted in the early years of the German Empire in the 1970s. Later, the empire agreed with the Catholic Church that it would better to collaborate because they had one common enemy, and that was organized labor and the fear of socialists in the late 19th century. But that experience informed the actions of the Catholic Church in the 1930s. They realized that it would be, or they thought it would be better to side with the Nazis in order to protect their own turf. This was not about living up to the moral teachings of the Catholic Church, but it was about protecting political power and influence. So in July 1933, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, signed the Concordat with the Reich President and thus complied with Hitler. So in return for the autonomy of clerical teaching and for the autonomy of Catholic schools, the Catholic Church agreed that all priests would swear an oath to the German Reich, so the German Empire, and Hitler personally. Now, the Protestant Church had always been in line with the political powers of the German Empire. So in the German Empire, the Protestant Church functioned under the motto of throne and altar, meaning that the Protestant Church would support the Prussian king to be the German emperor. In the early 1930s, there had already been several members of the Protestant Lutheran Church who had preached for a fascist interpretation of the theology. Soon the Nazis decided that it would be more opportune if they had also a representation within the Protestant Church. As with all independent institutions in Nazi Germany, the Nazis sent their own representatives into these organizations and founded their own. So this is known in Germany as a process of Gleichschaltung, so a synchronization between formerly independent institutions and the Nazi Party. In July 1933, almost simultaneously with the signing of the Concordat with the Vatican, a new institution was founded called For the Protestant Church, and it was run by a man who was also a NSDAP member. There was some resistance, but as such, the Protestant Church too complied with Nazi rule. For the very same reasons as the Catholic Church, the sense was that if we comply, we can protect our own turf, and we might even gain political power. Again, this is of course in violation of the teachings of any Christian denomination. But the idea was that you rather acquiesce and protect your own instead of standing up for others. And this is where the example of Hans and Sophie Scholl and their friends proves so exceptional. So they're very young at the time the Nazis come to power in January of 1933. And initially, as Andrew was saying, Hans joined the Hitler Youth and Sophie joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the Girl Scouts of the Nazis. But very soon they realized that actually their upbringing contradicted the conformity necessary to be a member of both of these organizations. And they fell out with the Hitler Youth and the BDM. They found inspiration from a lot of friends, many of whom were actually brought up in the Catholic Church. They themselves were brought up in a family that identified as Protestant Lutheran, but they identified with people who resisted the institutional complicity of both the big churches. And it is in response to a sermon by Bishop Graf von Galen, whom Dr. Carl Chant will soon talk about, that they decided as students to start or to print the first leaflet. By that time, both of them are students in Munich. Hans, the older, had been forced in the summer of 1942 to serve as medical staff on the Eastern Front. He himself had witnessed the atrocities and the murder of Jews in Eastern Europe. They had known about the discrimination before, obviously. But it is that experience and the realization that there are other people who resist. These are Catholic leaders who resisted, who did not comply with their institutions. They're Protestant Lutheran members, people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom they were in touch with, who had founded the Confessing Church in opposition to the majority Protestants. So these are the people that inspired their resistance. And they do build on their own education, which is rooted in the humanism of their father, especially, who was a German patriot who had worked across the aisles as a mayor in a small town of Bavaria. Their own father had been incarcerated twice under the Nazis because of his criticism of the Nazi regime. He had allowed his children to join the two Nazi youth organizations because he believed in the power of the free will. And this is exactly what inspired them to mount their resistance. Throughout the fall and very early fall of 1942 and early 1943, they print several leaflets to inspire resistance. And they forged bonds with other people who, as individuals, had believed in their moral conscience and the righteousness of standing up for what they believed. And this is the important lesson that we should all take away from these two young siblings who died at a very young age. Now, Sophie Scholl would have turned 102 in 2 weeks. She didn't even make it to her 22nd birthday. So what we should keep in mind when we think of Sophie and Hans Scholl is the importance to stand up for what we believe is right, even if we don't stand to gain anything, because this is what they did. They sacrificed their own lives for the belief that it was right to fight for the weak. It was right to fight for people who were discriminated against, who had been dehumanized by the Nazi regime. And this is what I hope we keep in mind for the remaining hour and a half. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harms. As you had touched on, it was in a context in which the symbols of God and country and state had been indiscriminately mixed that the Scholl siblings had grown up. And to the dismay of their more liberal parents, Hans and Sophie had begun their political lives as supporters of the ascendant Nazi cause, having been taken in by promises of national renewal and camaraderie. So the Scholl household became a sort of microcosm of the Nazis' national strategy to capture the hearts of the young and thereby secure its hold on a future generation of workers and soldiers. And that's the dynamic that the first musical excerpt is going to focus on. How a seemingly innocent love of God and country could be weaponized to political ends. Our point of departure is a short poem produced for a school primer, whose sing-song rhymes belie a much more sinister goal, to imbue the Nazi cause with a sense of holy righteousness. The text is juxtaposed against excerpt from the Nicene Creed and the 13th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans, where he urges believers to be subject to the governing authorities. The result is a pervasive conflation of the sacred and the profane, the spiritual and the political.